This is the AAA Astrophotography Meetup for August 6, 2018. First wanted to show you this incredible chart that Gary put together of images of Mars. Many members have been out with their telescopes trying to image the red planet during this opposition as it comes very close to Earth at this point of the year. So Gary collected 6 of these pictures and really put a really interesting amount of information on there. Remember the date of capture, the distance from Earth, observed magnitude, the equipment, and the true focal length of either the telescope or the telephoto lens that they were using. So get an idea of the scale of the different images. The actual size of the image in this chart varies depending on the focal length that each person used. Of course, there was lots of different processing methods used, so no 2 images are alike, and they all show you the different lengths that people have gone to photograph Mars in the last month. I'll talk today about composition. There's been various questions over the last few months about composition, about how to frame things in the viewfinder, what to put in, what to leave out, things like that. Composition is one of the hardest parts of photography to learn and also one of the hardest to teach. It's really based on more of an ephemeral and artistic approach to photography, a lot of art involved. And so if you can read up and maybe look at a lot of art, that's probably one of the best approaches to take. One good advice is to look at a lot of art. Go to places like the Metropolitan Museum to see paintings and drawings, to see how artists compose the scenes, directed the light, and drew your eye into the picture. Especially painters, drawers, they're actually creating the scene. As photographers, we're out there trying to photograph the scene, but if you look at paintings and drawings, they give you an idea of really what the artist was trying to think, how they're trying to portray the subject. Things like the Japanese and Chinese scrolls, you see a lot of flat perspective and very simple compositions. A lot of nature, of course, so that really applies to what a lot of us are doing here. Another great thing is the International Center of Photography, and especially right now in August until, let's see, up to September 2nd, there are 2 excellent shows there. One is Henri Cartier-Bresson, a well-known French photographer who did a lot of documentary work and helped create the photo collective called Magnum. Very good exhibit from one of the very first books that he published of his work. Cartier-Bresson really is the master of geometry and portraying very carefully composed images of a scene. He would wait for a long time to try to photograph the particular scene that he was thinking of in his mind, and he really has some of the best work out there. Elliott Erwitt, the Pittsburgh exhibit from 1915. Here, Elliott Erwitt was very young, 22-year-old photographer, and was asked to photograph the city for something called the Pittsburgh Project. So you really see a very young photographer at work, walking through streets, getting scenes in and around Pittsburgh in 1950. You see how he puts things in the frame and how he composes things. For New York City scenes, there are 2 very good photographers to look up or try to see in galleries or museum shows. Helen Levitt did a lot, almost exclusively did photography in New York City and in and around Manhattan. And so she has an amazing collection of pictures. You really see how she composes things and how she uses lines to draw you into the picture and the way people are looking left or right in the frame. You really get a good idea of what she was trying to portray. Bernice Abbott is another one who photographed a lot of the cityscape, a lot of city buildings from lots of different angles, like the one here looking down onto a night scene of Manhattan. So you really see the graphic content of this picture and how lines are going and the real sense of geometry that she has. And of course, Ansel Adams is probably one of the premier landscape photographers. Uh, Puts a very dramatic sense into his photos. He was possibly one of the very best printers of photography in the whole history of photography. So you can see what he does in the pictures, how he draws your eye in using curves of the river in this case, dramatic clouds over the mountains, and how he leads you into the picture and gets you involved in the image that he wants. Things that I talked about in the class are one of the main things in terms of composition of photography is the rule of thirds. It's not really a rule, it's more of a guideline. Picture a grid of 6 lines inside your viewfinder as you're looking at a scene, and you get a sense of how it works. The best thing is to try to avoid putting the main subject of your picture right in the center rectangle of this grid. Try to put something maybe off to the side of that rectangle, or a lot of times the guideline would be where the lines are intersecting, try to put an object. That puts a little bit off center, and it allows people to look at your picture and look around in your picture. If the subject is right at the center of the picture, there's no reason for anybody to look anywhere else in the photo. Your eye eventually gravitates back to the center to see the actual subject. And the main object for a photographer is to get people to look at the photo and look deep into it, look at different areas. If you've got the subject a little bit off center, adds a little tension to the picture. Your eye might go off center for a while, come back to another part of the picture, and eventually go back to the main object so that your eye is moving around. You're seeing everything that the photographer has tried to frame. So here's the moon and Venus over the city skyline, the Empire State Building lit up in blue, white, and red after the French victory in the World Cup soccer. And this photo was taken from Ganser State Park, just looking across the river. A few other tips for the composition is to keep the elements real simple in the photo, if you can. Cityscapes tend to be a little bit cluttered, but if you kind of simplify things, watch where buildings are especially at the edges of the photos. Very light or bright areas attract your attention. So if you've got the reflection of something, say on the water here, don't put it at the edge of the picture. Put it a little bit more toward the center of the frame, and it allows your eye to gravitate toward that area. Watch the horizons. Oftentimes I'll see in a lot of pictures horizons that are a little bit tilted to the left or the right, and generally the horizon as you see it is fairly straight, of course depending on the landscape or the cityscape that you're looking at. The best way to really compose a picture with the newer cameras, the digital DSLRs and the mirrorless camera, is to look through the viewfinder, not the rear screen. Because if you're looking through the viewfinder, you really are focusing on the subject matter that your eye is just seeing what the camera lens is seeing. You're not really distracted by too much. If you're looking through the rear screen, like for example, if you turn on the live view in a lot of cameras and you try to compose that way, your eye is seeing a lot of stuff around you to the left and to the right, and things that aren't in the picture, and so you can't really concentrate on what is actually going to be in the frame of the photo. So if you use the viewfinder, even in the mirrorless cameras where there's a small screen that you're looking at, it makes you really concentrate on what is in the frame, how things are moving in the frame, and how you could move things back and forth. What I do now is I'll go into Photoshop with a wider example of this picture. This was taken with a much wider angle lens of the whole scene. And what we can do here is kind of duplicate what you would do if you're looking around at a scene like this. Your eye takes in pretty much a very wide angle of the scene. But what we can do is see what happens. And say that's your scene. and you want maybe to focus just on the moon and the Empire State Building. So you can look around, you can put the Empire State Building, say, right in the middle of the frame, and that gets you the building right in the middle, and so everything on equal distances on the other side. But again, that's kind of allows your eye to settle there and not really move around too much. What we can do is then move your eye around and say, well, I'll put the building a little bit off center because then the moon and Venus will be very much off center. That creates sort of a diagonal in this composition and allows your eye to come back through into the frame itself. One thing that you see a lot in cityscapes, a lot of building pictures, especially taken with a pretty wide angle lens, is the building itself, they start to lean back. Wide angle lenses, they're trying to cram in all that information into the picture. If you tilt the camera back slightly, like you're trying to get more of the building or more of the sky, the buildings themselves will start to either tilt over to the left or right, or appear as if they're tilting to the back. There's really a very easy way to fix that. You go into Filter and Lens Correction in Photoshop. Click on that. A new page will open up, and you'll see your photo there, and a lot of different menu items that you could do. The best would be to go to Custom. Near the bottom of this menu items on the right-hand side is something called Transform. So we're dealing right now with the vertical perspective, things that are vertical in our photo. So if we start moving this, you will see, now this exaggerates it in that direction, and this way things start to straighten up. What it's doing is essentially stretching the picture so that the verticals start to remain vertical, and you can see the buildings start to straighten up there, especially on the right-hand side. And so everything becomes, in a vertical perspective, more or less the way you saw it. It was a pretty wide angle lens, and you could see that the horizon is low in the frame, which means I was probably tilting back the camera quite a bit. So that's a fairly large correction. I will hit OK on that, and then we go back to our main Photoshop page, and things seem to be straight. The thing to watch out for is there are often buildings like these new ones that are right near the river that are actually, they are tilting off, and that's sort of the way that the architecture is, which confuses lots of photographers in that way. So let's see. We'll go back to the cropping, and I'll say, well, let's see. I don't want to put the horizon right in the middle. I'll put the horizon low in the frame, put the Empire State Building a little bit off to the side. We'll bring the frame in this way. I've got the crop tool set at the ratio of the 35mm frame, so that this sort of duplicates you putting on the zoom lens and zooming in a little bit. So you zoom in a little bit, and you see, well, I want to move things up or down, left or right. So you're looking through your viewfinder, and this is how you're viewing the scene. You come across the moon and the Empire State Building, and you could say, well, this is how I'll place things in the scene. And then that becomes your picture. When you're working in Photoshop with the crop tool, it automatically does something similar to a rule of thirds grid, as you can see it. There's 6 lines going across and up and down. So that can also help you if you're cropping your image. And so that becomes, say, the final image out of our crop there. Let's see, going back to our other images. The buildings themselves are sort of like mountains or trees out in the wilderness. We can use them to frame objects in the sky like the moon. So if you've got a moonrise, think something like the photographer's ephemeris is a good tool to use to determine, well, where's the moon going to be as it's rising or setting, especially as it gets closer to the horizon, and that can help you compose your photo. If you're shooting something a lot wider, then uh, the moon still could be an element up in the sky. Uh, the longest lens I used so far in the pictures that I've showed you is a 200 millimeter lens, and so this is at about 70 millimeters, and you get a kind of a wide view of the west side of Manhattan, looking over the reservoir in Central Park. Uh, the one thing that would also you'd want to concentrate on is the actual brightness of the buildings. I know that a lot of with your eye you can see a fair amount. This actually might be too bright. I could go to the brightness and I could bring down the brightness a little bit so that there's you see a little bit less. The buildings themselves are a little darker than before, which then emphasizes more of the moon and the lights in the water, which to me is maybe what you'd really want people to see. And looking back at this picture, I think what I did was I framed it and didn't look carefully as I'm framing it, and these bright lights are right along the edge here. So what happens is that we're looking at the picture, we see the moon, we see the reflections, and up in the corner of your eye, you see these bright lights that attracts your attention here. So you tend to move over and look this way, which is what I'd rather have you look more toward the moon and the main part of the picture. So as I'm processing, I could just crop that out. And that just gets rid of the very bright areas along the side of the picture. I'll go back and forth and show you the result of the crop there. So that just improves it a little bit, keeps your eye more into the frame itself, keeps it from essentially moving off the frame of the picture. And of course, the full moon rises. No need to put the full moon dead center in the picture. You move that off to the side a little bit and try to frame that within the cityscape or the landscape that you're shooting. In the wilderness, you've got things like trees and rocks, mountains that you could frame the elements in your sky with. Oftentimes, it means putting your camera tripod very, very low. I was pretty low to the trail as I saw this scene, looking pretty high, looking up at a high angle toward this the gnarled tree on the upper right-hand side. But that just made for a better angle as I'm looking higher up into the sky, getting more of the sky. I didn't really need any kind of detail along the bottom part of this picture, but the rock, these trees help frame the entire scene by taking up a good portion of the right-hand side of this picture. This is a pretty good example of framing a scene with the trees. So I'm standing actually underneath within this juniper pine at the north rim of the Grand Canyon, using the branches, using the tree itself to frame the sky. To me, it doesn't matter that I'm not showing a whole lot of the sky itself. The stars show through a lot of the branches and the needles, but the idea is to kind of frame this above the canyon itself. And so the canyon, the formations in the canyon are lit very nicely by a setting moon, and I'm able to get the summer Milky Way in the photo here. Good thing is to experiment with different angles, move around. Sometimes 1 foot in either direction can make a huge difference in your picture, especially as foreground and background elements either line up or don't line up. You might want take a couple different pictures and see what works out best. Another way to make pictures interesting, more three-dimensional, is to bring leading lines from the foreground into your picture. So I've used the root of a dead tree and some of the branches to bring your eye into the photo itself, and focus mainly on the foreground here. To me, having the background in focus didn't really matter, because that way more of your attention goes along to the tree branches here. You end up looking into the picture, seeing the sky, seeing something like the Big Dipper a little bit out of focus there, and the rest of the stars. But to me, the main part of the picture is really more toward the foreground and the center. And these lines here help bring your eye in, but also help you keep your eye into the image itself. The lighting, of course, is crucial to what we do. This is the moonrise, the moon rising, lighting up Balanced Rock in Arches National Park. And from this angle that Rush, my friend, and I found, the moon was lighting up the Balanced Rock and this pretty large rock next to it. At least the face, as we were looking at it, was in deep shadow, so that all the light is actually just going on the rock. And so in this picture, your attention goes straight to the Balanced Rock instead of meandering around. The foreground tends to be a little bit darker than the rock, and I placed the Milky Way in the center, in between the dark rock and the Balanced Rock. The same with star trails. Polaris doesn't need to be right in the dead center. It could be off to either side, or you might not even have to include Polaris in the photos. You can go a little tighter and see what happens to the trails if they're going up or down, and combine that with your landscape. My friend Ken Spencer, who came with us on the Big Bend trip, took this very nice photo of the moon in Long Island. He timed it so that the brightness of the moon was very close to the brightness of the sky and the trees, so that he took one shot and everything fell into place in terms of the lighting. And it's just a matter of timing your way when you go out and say, well, when is the moon rising? When is twilight coming? How do things balance out? Because the moon is fairly bright. And so with that, I'll end the composition, and we'll look forward to our next astrophotography meetup.